the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who's marking 100 days in office. He's delivering his first address to the National Press Club since Labor's election victory in May. Anthony Albanese with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club in Canberra and the Westpac Address. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. Anthony Albanese last addressed the club on May 18, just 3 days before the federal election. He told us then that he was focused on what Labor was going to do in government, not just on changing who lives in the ministerial wing. There were many questions at the time about whether he had limited the scope for action by replicating the former government's policies on a range of issues, including foreign policy and tax cuts. Now, 100 days on from that election, he has the floor today to reflect on how things have gone to date, be more expansive about his ambitions for government and for this week's Job Summit. Please welcome Prime Minister Anthony Albanese with his address entitled Building for a Better Future.
Well, thanks very much, Laura, and I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues who are here with me today: Jim Chalmers, Katie Gallagher, Brendan O'Connor, Ed Husick, Annika Wells, Dave Smith and Meryl Swanson, and thank them for their support in being here with me today on our 100 days. I'm proud to lead a government that is advancing the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Colleagues, the great privilege, the great opportunity and the solemn responsibility of government is putting our ambition for the country into action, converting the promises of a campaign into the progress of a nation, writing our vision for Australia's future into the laws of the land. Our government is only 100 days into this journey, but we are resolved on the destination of a better future. We are focused on building a fair wage, strong growth, high productivity economy. An Australia where working hard means you can pay the bills, support your family, save for the future and achieve your aspirations. An Australia where everyone can trust in quality services, strong Medicare, affordable childcare, decent aged care and a national disability insurance scheme that fulfils its great promise. An Australia where investments in education and training and skills and housing and infrastructure and technology mean the doors of opportunity are open to everyone in every part of our great country. I recognise that we're facing challenging times right now. I know a lot of people are doing it really tough, but I'm optimistic about our country. I believe in the Australian people and I'm energised by the work of building a better future. After a wasted decade, we are not wasting a day. From the moment we were sworn in, we've been working to clear away the mess and chaos of a government who dealt in short-term political stitch-ups, not long-term solutions. We've hit the ground running, restoring security to the national energy grid, delivering support to flood-affected communities, implementing the strongest ever biosecurity measures to protect our agricultural sector, establishing the Defence Strategic Review to make sure that our Defence Force has the capability to meet our changing national security environment, and backing a pay rise for workers on the minimum wage, lifting our climate change ambition and rebuilding Australia's reputation in the region and in our international relations. We've also moved to change the way that government functions, because we understand that governing is bigger than cleaning up after your predecessors, and it's so much more than just reacting to events. Governing can't just be an exercise in getting through to the end of the day to the other side of the story or even to the next election. Government has a responsibility to plan for the future, to build for the long term, to implement the reforms that arm people with every chance to fulfil their potential. Not change for the sake of it, reforms that help people to lead better and more fulfilling lives. Central to all of this, fundamental to everything we seek to achieve, is a fairer, stronger, more resilient and more rewarding economy. And getting there, building that high productivity, strong growth, fair wage future, depends on understanding where Australia is now and what's brought us to this point. I see it in phases. We've been through the pandemic response. We're in the middle of the recovery, and reform will be the key to renewal. From response and recovery to reform and renewal, the guiding focus of government action for the coming years. If you think back to March 2020, virtually the sole priority of every level of government was containing the pandemic. That meant border closures, lockdowns, restrictions and billions of dollars in support to try to take edge off the economic consequences. There's plenty about those times we would happily forget, but there are vital lessons that we have to learn. It was a race, and in too many ways, Australia wasn't ready for that race. We were left vulnerable, not just by complacency and a failure to plan, but by years of cuts and willful neglect to the very services and skills that we needed most. We found ourselves economically exposed, hanging on the end of the global supply chain, and we saw the harm of petty partisanship, the damage which was done by the federal government stoking division with the states. Now, whatever we might wish, COVID isn't gone or forgotten. Our health system, our hospitals and our extraordinary healthcare workforce are still under enormous strain. We continue to encourage all Australians to get their third and fourth dose of the vaccine, and we've made it a priority to cooperate with state and territory leaders and the health experts to provide support and resources where they are most needed. But clearly, no one is going back to the response phase. Australia is already in the recovery phase, and that's presenting its own economic challenges, including significant and unpredictable supply and demand imbalances which are driving up costs for businesses as well as for families. Our immediate priority as a Labor government is shoring up the economy to give families, households, businesses the security and certainty that they need. There are also many industries and small businesses that were effectively switched off at the wall and are struggling to reboot. We see that with hospitality and tourism and international education. And then there are sectors that were already under pressure from cuts and neglect, which have been pushed to breaking point over the last 2 years. Aged care, childcare, schools, hospitals. Through hard times, Australians have been simply magnificent, resourceful, resilient, always looking out for others. We saw small businesses innovate and evolve, investing in a decade's worth of technological change in just a year. We saw workers adapt and thrive, proving flexibility and productivity can go together. The success stories are a continuing inspiration. But there were heavy sacrifices too. Teachers reinventing learning for our children, particularly practically overnight. Healthcare and aged care workers being asked to carry on when so much about COVID was unknown. It's no wonder people are exhausted. It's no surprise that so many teachers and nurses and carers are thinking about leaving their vocation. In the pressure cooker of the COVID response, educators and the care and community sector were hailed as essential to the strength of our economy, to the well-being of our society. But the fact is, This has always been true. There's nothing more important than educating our children or caring for our family members when they are sick or looking after our parents when they grow old. A healthy economy depends on healthy people, and education is our most powerful weapon against disadvantage, the best long-term generator of economic growth and productivity. Over the next decade, we're going to need more educators and more carers and more nurses in every part of our system. We won't do that with broken institutions and burnout staff. And whether it's educational skills or healthcare or aged care, we can't just stem the bleeding and hope for the best. We can't return to business as usual when we know that business as usual was simply not good enough. We have to aim higher than just recovery. That's why I say we need reform to achieve renewal, to drive the change that we need in the here and now, but always with a view to how we can shape the future. This is the core of the economic plan that we took to the election, that I outlined here, as Laura said, just 3 days before people cast their vote. Cleaner and cheaper energy, better skills and training, cheaper childcare, and a future made here in Australia. My team and I are taking on the challenges of today, and we are building for the opportunities of tomorrow. We are cleaning up the mess of the last decade, and we are preparing Australia for success in the next decade. Whether it's wages or skills, national security or energy, we will act with urgency when it is required. But we will never take our eyes off the big prize, and the big prize is always the future. The chance to secure a new generation of prosperity and fairness for all Australians. Good governments, reforming Labor governments, do both. They face up to the urgent problems of the here and now and take Australia forward to not just imagine a better future, but set about creating one. And the way that we do that, the how, matters as well. When I was here at the National Press Club, I outlined just that. I said the best way to achieve progress is to bring people together. We are giving life to that statement this week. I know there's a school of political thought that views cooperation as capitulation, consensus as weakness. I know there are those who think that everything has to be about conflict, but Australians have conflict fatigue. Our country has lost nearly a decade to the inertia that division produces. We've seen the damage it does to the economy, the toll it takes on the country. Skills and apprenticeships degraded by cuts to TAFE and training. National infrastructure consumed by political pork barrelling. Australia falling to 70th in the world for women's economic participation and opportunity. Climate action and energy policy hostage to denial and delay. And a workplace relations system that's not delivering productivity gains for business or pay rises for workers. These aren't abstract problems. Australians are paying a real price. Of course there are international factors driving up the cost of living, but it's also clearly the legacy of a decade of wage suppression and insecure work, and too many Australians being locked out of the labour force. Years of undercutting bulk billing, goading manufacturers into leaving the country so we make less here. Supply chains neglected for a decade, and absolute chaos on energy policy driving up power bills. Not only does a culture of division and dysfunction and conflict create these kind of urgent problems in the short term, it stops our country building for the long term. If your priority is scoring day-to-day political points, then the future loses out. This is why our government is focused on solutions, not arguments. The Jobs and Skills Summit we're convening this week is evidence of this. It signals we are willing to look at the hard questions, to face up to the big challenges, to embrace the need for real reform, to solve widespread skills shortages that act as a handbrake on our economy, to remove the barriers that prevent people entering the workforce, to make sure productivity gains translate into rising incomes for Australians. And the summit shows that we're determined to do it by bringing people together, getting everyone in the room, premiers and chief ministers, business and industry leaders, union representatives, a cross-section of civil society and community groups. This week's gathering will be the culmination of more than 100 pre-summit consultations that ministers and government members have conducted all over the country, drawing on input from thousands of Australians, looking at everything from improving economic participation for people with disability, to addressing our migration challenges, to boosting the numbers of Australians training in new technologies. The Treasurer has published a clear set of ground rules, so we're not starting with a blank piece of paper. We're working to a plan, and I'm hopeful there will be some immediate actions coming out of the summit that we can work to implement. But Friday is not the end of the story. The government is preparing an employment white paper, and this week's discussions and ideas will feed into that important document. For us, the principle is straightforward. We want every Australian to have the opportunity and skills to find a secure job with fair pay in a safe workplace, not a hand-to-mouth existence where bills chase you from shift to shift, but a job that helps you build a life and plan for the future. The policies we took to the election were central to this, making job security and gender pay equity objectives of the Fair Work Act, making wage theft a crime, closing the loopholes that allow firms to use labour hire as a tool for driving down pay rather than a source of specialist skills, investing in fee-free TAFE, additional university places and creating new apprenticeships, and creating expert panels focused on pay equity for the care and community sector. In our first 100 days, we've argued for and secured a 5.2% pay rise for minimum wage workers, the heroes of the economic front line. We've made a submission to the Fair Work Commission in support of higher pay for aged care workers. We've introduced legislation for 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave, because no woman should ever have to choose between their safety and their job. But after a decade in which low wages were deployed as a deliberate design feature, we want wages rising and productivity increasing across the board. And after 30 years in which the gender pay gap has hardly budged, we need serious improvement in economic equality for women. This is going to take more than legislative change. We need a culture change too, a revitalising of bargaining and negotiation and give and take, new leadership on respect and safety and fairness for working women. This is why we're bringing employers and employees to the table this week in Canberra, to elevate and accelerate these conversations. Of course, none of us imagine that a two-day summit will entirely fix wages and job security. I know that when we wrap up on Friday afternoon, there will still be $1 trillion of debt. Australian families will still be struggling with the cost of living pressures. Businesses, big and small, will still need help with staff and skills. But for the first time in a long time, I believe we will be moving to agreement on how to solve these problems rather than arguing over who is to blame for them. So yes, I want to see progress on skills and training, on wages and apprenticeships. But the biggest single outcome I'm hoping for is the beginning of a new culture of cooperation, a renewed understanding between unions and industry and small business and government and community groups, that building a stronger, fairer and more productive economy is our shared responsibility and our common interest. This is how we get employers and employees and small business negotiating for genuine win-win outcomes. It's how we make our federation work better, lifting efficiency, improving services and boosting productivity. This is how we sweep aside the persistent structural barriers that prevent women from securing decent jobs and careers and enjoying financial security over their lives. It's how we change the way that Australia looks at childcare as an economic reform which promotes inclusion and growth, not as a babysitting service. An economic reform that delivers benefits to 2 generations of Australians simultaneously. The best start in life for our children, flexible support for modern families, and a multi-billion-dollar boost to productivity and participation without adding to inflation. It's how we seize the transformative opportunity of Australia as a clean energy superpower. More affordable, more reliable renewable energy, powering a new generation of advanced manufacturing and value adding. Australian workers, Australian technology, Australian research and Australian resources, taking the world to net zero. It's how we build the sense of ownership and common purpose our country needs to achieve real and lasting change in everything from early education through to childcare. I'm not saying this will be easy or that it can come without compromise, but I do want the Australian people to know that we are up for this challenge. Put simply, we're having a crack. We're not just occupying the space. That's what governments voted for, people voted for in May the 21st. Governments can build infrastructure, they can create institutions, but they can also draw on our national values. Governments foster a culture of reform and progress and cooperation, nourish a spirit of shared effort for fair reward. Whether it's the summit or the Parliament or National Cabinet, or here indeed with the Canberra Press Gallery, we're never going to agree on everything. We're never going to have 100% of people 100% happy with every decision and with every outcome. But I know we'll get more done and we'll do it better if we disagree constructively, if we debate respectfully, if we look at the substance of issues rather than question motives, and together if we search for solutions. Good government must drive this culture to make the case for reforms. In order to do that, we need to rebuild trust in government. My colleagues and I don't share the strange self-loathing of our predecessors, raging against the role of government while in government, obsessing over secrecy, having to be shamed into doing the bare minimum at the last possible moment. An ideology that meant even as they made government bigger, the Liberals and Nationals showed no interest in making government work better. 100 days ago, on the 21st of May, the Australian people voted for a better future. Australians have placed their trust in our new Labor government, and I thank them for it. We are determined to repay that trust by demonstrating a commitment to transparency and integrity, holding ourselves to a higher standard of behaviour than it's not illegal, creating a National Anti-Corruption Commission with real power and authority, and examining brutal failures of government services like robo-debt to make sure that that kind of betrayal of vulnerable people can never, ever happen again. Above all, we recognise that renewing people's trust in government requires us to prove government can deliver for people. I know good government can change lives, but I understand that many Australians feel like government doesn't work for them, that politics is obsessed with the short term. And frankly, the only way to change that is to deliver on what matters to the Australian people. And that means taking action on cost of living, cheaper medicine, cheaper childcare, more affordable housing, more renewable energy to bring down power bills. And it means implementing the reforms which create opportunities, lift living standards and include people in the benefits of our national progress. We've been in government now for just 100 days, but my colleagues and I are not there just to mark time. We're here to build the strong growth, fair wage, high productivity economy that will deliver the next generation of prosperity for Australians. Achieving this, moving beyond response and recovery to reform and renewal, will take hard work and it will take tough decisions. It will demand cooperation. It will require us to persevere in the face of tough times. But I have unlimited faith in the people of Australia and their ability and their capacity to rise to the challenge. At the most basic level, three things got us through the pandemic. One, closing our borders. Two, our public health system and vaccinations. And three, the resilience and resolve of Australians. Well, we can't close our borders to the challenges that we are facing now. And we can't vaccinate ourselves against economic competition in our globalised world. And we're not immune to evolving technology. We can't isolate ourselves from climate change or the national security challenges in our region. But our most powerful advantage, our greatest asset, remains the Australian people. And investing in people is how we make economic reform work. It's the answer to the productivity question, and it's the foundation for long-term renewal. This is the heart of our agenda, responding to the challenges of today, reforming for the opportunities of tomorrow, more secure work and fair wages in safe workplaces, proper funding for every stage of education and training and skills, real action on equality for women, backing the services which empower people to fulfil their potential, Medicare, the NDIS, aged care, and cleaner, cheaper energy which will power a new generation of jobs in communities across the country, but particularly in our regions. This is how Labor governments changed the country, investing in people's potential, rewarding their hard work, supporting their aspirations. If we cooperate, if we work together, if we act with purpose and unity and ambition, then we won't just ride out these tough times. We will be well on our way to a better future. And it is that better future that remains our light on the hill, as it always has been. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Prime Minister. I'm sure that my colleagues are going to have a lot of questions for you about industrial relations and the Jobs Summit. But just taking up a couple of the points that you made just now, particularly about the importance of aged care workers, childcare workers, teachers, nurses in the health system, and noting how essential they've been and how exhausted they must be. The Andrews government announced measures overnight to free new nursing trainees from HECS obligations. I was just wondering whether the idea of relieving existing workers in those fields from some or all of their HECS debts would be something that addressed not just the need to reward and recognise them, but also keeping them in those workforces, and also, since those particular areas tend to be very dominated by women, whether it was also something that addressed gender equity issues. Is that something, and is that a sort of an instrument that the government would consider using more aggressively?
Well, we've got Katie Gallagher here. So as the Finance Minister, I'm not about to make multi-billion-dollar commitments on the run. And that's why she attends these events, to make sure that ministers don't go completely outside our ERC process. But I did speak to Premier Andrews this morning, and it's a good initiative that he's undertaking. But we have our own initiatives as well. Fee-free TAFE, the additional university places aimed at areas of skill shortage. So the different levels of government have to pull the levers that are available to them, and we are certainly pulling those levers. for across the workforce, across the health workforce, including the commitments that we've made to support increases of wages, for example, for people in aged care. But as well, making gender pay equity an objective of the Fair Work Act will change the dynamic and the consideration that the Fair Work Commission can make when it has cases before it as well. And I think that's an important initiative, as is our establishing of a couple of bodies within the Fair Work Commission to particularly focus on gender pay equity. The truth is that gender pay equity went the wrong way in the last figures, and it has essentially stalled over a long period of time. But there's a range of measures that we need to look at that will make a difference. Our childcare policy will make a difference as well by recognising that it's not about welfare, it's an economic reform. If women are able to more fully participate in the workforce, they not only will have greater chance of advancement and higher wages while they're in work, they'll retire with higher superannuation balances as well.
Michelle Grattan.
Michelle Grattan from The Conversation. Prime Minister, on your reform agenda, are you willing to legislate for significant industrial relations reform to the wages system, even if there is not consensus on the way that should go? And would any legislation wait until after the White Paper?
Well, some legislation we'll have ready by the coming session during what's become the budget session of when we will sit, and that is the legislation to change the Fair Work Act to make wage theft a crime and a range of other measures that we committed to in the election. And we're hopeful that if this week near consensus emerges from the discussions on Thursday and Friday, then we would look at change in an expedient fashion. I take great heart from the debate that took place yesterday with Jennifer and Sally, who are here, the respective leaders of the BCA and the ACTU. You had a mature debate about common interests. They didn't agree on everything, but that's the sort of maturity that we are trying to foster. So we will have a look at what comes about this week, potentially take further action from what we've foreshadowed. But quite clearly, as I foreshadowed before the election in my speech before the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, enterprise bargaining at the moment isn't working. It's not lifting productivity, it's not working for workers, and it's not working for business. So if we can work through ways to improve that with as much support as possible, then great. But we also are prepared to lead on issues as well, and I think we've shown that. We don't want to wait for everyone to agree on everything, not much will happen. We've been through a decade of not much happening. We want to get wages moving. It was a clear commitment that we made before the election. We said that, for example, we wanted the increase in the minimum wage. The Fair Work Commission responded, I think, in part to our submission, but made an independent decision of 5.2%. And guess what? If you go outside, the sky's still there. The former government said that the sky would fall in. Businesses would fold. It'll all end if we give people $1 an hour more. It didn't happen. It was a good decision. I'm pleased it did.
Kieran Gilbert.
Thanks, Laura. Prime Minister, at the weekend you said that you don't want to look back and wish you had a crack. You said a similar sentiment today in the speech. Asked, do you fear failure? You said, no, I fear not trying. Can I ask you on the reform side of things, our country's facing huge costs, NDIS, aged care, talk of another 28 joint strike fighters. Are you going to have a crack at the reform necessary to pay for all that?
It's a good question, and it's one that government we'll have to address, of course, over a period of time. One of the things we're going through with the ERC process in the lead up to the budget in October is the fiscal position that we have inherited with $1 trillion of debt and not much to show for it. And if you look at the projections of what will be required over a period of time with rising defence expenditure, the NDIS, a range of other expenditures that will be required, we need to have a debate about how we pay for that over a period of time. But I've said very clearly that our focus at the moment is about jobs and skills and the summit we have on. And that in part is answering the question as well. If you improve secure work, if you improve the wages that people are paid, they pay more tax, they are less of a burden on the welfare system, businesses increase their profits, therefore there's more company tax being paid as well. You boost productivity, you boost national economic growth. Our plan is a growth agenda. It is unashamedly pro-business, but it's also unashamedly pro-workers. We want an economy that works for people, not the other way around. So we will continue to address these issues over a period of time, but we're focused on what we said before the election and delivering it, and that's what we'll continue to do.
Andrew Probyn.
Prime Minister, my question follows quite neatly from Kieran's. As you've said today a couple of times that you inherited a $1 trillion debt, you also inherited a tax plan that predates the pandemic, which includes tax cuts that you perhaps would not legislate in current circumstances, tax cuts that you supported as a Labor Party, perhaps because you didn't want to be seen as anti-aspirational. But given that the facts have changed and that there are so many things that your government and the governments after yours have to pay for, will you, under any circumstances, change your mind on this stage 3 tax cuts? Can you guarantee here and now that those tax cuts, which half of which goes to the top 10% of earners, will remain as they are?
Well, Andrew, people need to look at what happened with the tax cuts, which were that we actually tried to amend out the stage 3 of the tax cuts, and we weren't successful. And they were legislated. And what we said at the time, if you go back and look at the comments that I made, I said at the time that it wasn't wise to consider that you knew in 2019 exactly what the economy would look like in 2024-25. But the Parliament made a decision. Parliament made a decision to legislate those tax cuts, and we made a decision that we would stand by that legislation rather than relitigate it, and we haven't changed our opinion.
But if it wasn't wise then have you got the courage to argue why it's not wise now?
This is a bonus question to Mr. Probyn.
It's a good one, though.
I don't want to channel my predecessor about Andrew, but we made those statements then, and we weren't successful. We weren't successful at the time. We inherited it, and I've said that we haven't changed our position that we articulated when we made that call, because we're in a situation of all or nothing at the time, and we voted for tax cuts because to vote against the package would have been voting against tax cuts, including for people who desperately needed it at the time.
Chris Yeoman, who I'm sure will be much more disciplined than my colleague.
Scott Morrison's not the only person to say Andrew over and over again. Chris Ullman, 9 News. Prime Minister, the International Energy Agency points to the fact that critical minerals will be absolutely central to the energy transformation. So can you tell us what work is being done to find out what minerals Australia will need, how many minerals we will need, how they will be secured, and what will happen to the cost curve of those resources when the entire world wants them at the same time?
It's a very good question, Chris, and it's an essential one. And what it points to is the opportunity that's there. If you look at so many of the rare earths and minerals that the world will need and will be in demand, we have a lot of them. What we need to do is to make sure that in the structures that are put in place, we can still have access to them. But also, I believe it's an opportunity for us to take a bit of a different approach to what perhaps we've done in the past with resources. The exporting of our resources will continue to be important, but where possible, we should value add here. And with the changing nature of the production process, with labour being less a proportion of input costs for production, we have that opportunity. And that's why I speak about a future made in Australia, and the work that we're doing through people like Ed Husick and the National Reconstruction Fund, through Brendan O'Connor and the creation of Jobs and Skills Australia, through our entire economic team, is how do we maximise the value for Australia? And that is also about our national security interests as well. So, for example, we have everything that goes into a battery. We have lithium, we have copper, we have all of those minerals that will increasingly be in demand. We should be value adding here, and some of the announcements that we made in places like Gladstone and in Kwinana and other places as well around Australia were aimed at that. And I hope that that's something that's discussed at the Jobs and Skills Summit as well, is how, because in part you need labour with the skills to take advantage of that as well. I'd just raise one example of why it's important beyond just making things here, why it's a national security issue. At the moment, about 85% of the world's solar panels are made in one country. I think you can guess which one it is. That will rise to in excess of 95% in a decade's time. If the world is totally dependent at a time when solar energy is more and more important on just one country, then that changes the whole power imbalance of what happens if that access is switched off. So we need to actually learn these lessons of the pandemic to be more resilient, to take more advantage, to stand on our own 2 feet. And it's one of the reasons why I am so optimistic about Australia's future, is that we have these natural advantages. And let's not waste the opportunity. Let's not look back and say, oh, we wish we had have acted. And so this government, my government, is absolutely determined to ensure that Australia, both in terms of Australian businesses but also Australian workers, get the benefit from the luck that we have, frankly, on this great island continent of ours.
Karen Barlow.
Karen Barlow from the Canberra Times. You've had about 100 days to look under the hood of the public service. I'm curious about the state that the coalition left it, and I am mindful of the fact that there is a inquiry underway into what Mr Morrison did in secret, but this is broader than that. How is the public service, is it match fit for the 21st century to deliver your reform agenda, to be transparent, accountable and frank and fearless? What is your level of confidence in the public service?
I think the independence and processes of the public service were undermined over a long period of time. I've been somewhat surprised because some of the detail isn't known until you're in government, that people who I knew, good professional public servants, put off by the Department of, widgets, then re-employed as contractors, being paid more than they were as the DepSec of the Department of Widgets, but that whole process being undermined in terms of the public service. The truth is that cabinet processes under the former government were completely trashed. Cabinet isn't to have PowerPoint presentations from pollsters. It's for serious consideration of policy based upon advice from the public service. And there's someone here I met just before who was a former secretary who spoke about that. I think that it will take time to rebuild, but we're doing that. I've met with the secretary of all of the departments of the public service. Every one of my ministers has gone to their department and had meetings, not with the secretary and DepSecs and the executive, with all of the public service who are there. I've met with all the workers at various agencies, including our intelligence agencies. And that's been really well received. And guess what? Who knew? If you treat your workers with respect, you'll get better outputs. Like, it's not rocket science. And that was ignored by the former government. But it will take time to repair. And if there are people out there who are watching this right now, I'd say being a public servant is an honourable profession. Think about it. People who are public servants don't do it for the money. Most of them could earn more in the private sector. They do out of their commitment to public service. And I think that we need to get back to that. My government, through the actions of the ministry, are trying to do that. And that's important because it's in our national interest for that to happen.
Phil Curry.
Thanks, Laura. Mr Albanese, if I could just ask about immigration and all the speculation that we're going to increase the target on the back of the Jobs Summit, or the intake. So your predecessor, Mr Morrison, said in March, when asked whether he was prepared to go above 160,000 in response to requests by the business community, he left it open, but he said you just don't turn on the tap and all of a sudden they all turn up. And that's in reference to migration coming to a halt during the COVID years. And he said it's not something we'd have to look at for at least a year or more. Is that still the current understanding within government, or do you expect us to hit that 160 sooner? Are you anticipating lifting it sooner rather than later, I guess is my question.
Well, I'll be undertaking genuine consultation with business and unions at the end of this week. I'll make a couple of points though. One, it probably wasn't the wisest decision during the pandemic to tell everyone who was a temporary visa holder to leave and to provide them with no income and no support, which means many of them have left with ill feeling towards Australia, and that spreads around. We've got a globalised labour market, and we need to enhance our reputation. Australia is a great place to live or to visit, and we need to always bear that in mind. And I think some of the actions that occurred then weren't wise. But secondly, also, I think it's not just about numbers. It's about how we do this beyond, yes, addressing the urgent needs which are there in particular professions, but also in areas like hospitality. There's massive skill shortages. Every restaurant will tell you that that's the case. But also about the nature of the mix as well. The truth is that, unfortunately, in some areas, temporary labour have been used to undercut wages and conditions, and we don't want that either. But what we need to do is, in areas, in my view, I've said this before, so on the table is my view that we need more paths to permanent migration rather than just temporary labour. There are areas and professions that we have, whether they be nurses, chefs, engineers, to name 3 separate professions that don't relate to each other, but there are many more, where we have had skills shortages not for a year, but for decades. The idea that you train someone and bring them out here for a couple of years and then go and try and find someone else to do the same job is, in my view, incredibly inefficient, and is a part of a way that potentially the IR system's undermined by that as well. Far better to give someone a sense of ownership and a stake in this country. We are, with the exception of First Nations people, all migrants or descendants of migrants. We're a migration country. And we need to look at ways in which those pathways are got through in areas of skill shortage that can be identified as ones that will continue to be there. Some areas of IT, the whole creation of Jobs and Skills Australia, the idea is that you plan beyond just a year, that you plan where do we need to be in 5 years, 10 years' time. We need to look at migration, but we need to do it in a way that never looks beyond, where that doesn't usurp the need for us to give first opportunity as well to Australians to be trained and skilled up for jobs as well. Because whilst the unemployment rate, is 3.4, the number of people who have been long-term unemployed and the period in which they've been long-term unemployed isn't shrinking. We need to use this opportunity to pick up some of those people who have been left behind and give them a chance.
Could I just clarify, Prime Minister, there's a lot of discussion about the permanent migration intake being lifted, but what exactly is the state of play about temporary workers? You alluded to the fact that they're all told to go away. Where is that up to at the moment? Yes, there are problems in the existing onshore workforce, but what are you doing to facilitate a lot of those areas that were filled by those people in the short term?
Well, we are looking at that as well. And one of the problems, of course, is to go back to Karen's question about the public service. There weren't enough people processing visas. We've had to take people from other areas. So it's absurd for Australia's reputation that someone who's wanted to be here, the business wants them to be here, has waited 12, 18 months to get into Australia. That's a very bad thing. So we also need to address temporary visas will always have a role. No question about that. But what I'm saying is, where the opportunity is there to look beyond the short term, we should be doing it.
Rosie Lewis.
Rosie Lewis from The Australian. In July, you said it wasn't the right time to consider reducing from 7 to 5 days mandatory COVID isolation. When will be the right time? Will it be considered this week when National Cabinet meets? And what confidence can you give business that it won't become a permanent fixture of the pandemic?
Well, we've had those discussions at National Cabinet, and Dominic Perrottet's position has been very clear. But the other thing we did in July, the last time we had a discussion, was we've moved away from the states all having different systems. So we have 8 different systems operating. So one of the things that Premier Perrottet has done is raise the issue. He spoke to me about it last week and the week before. It's something that he has a position on that's very public. We'll have a discussion about that on Wednesday when we hear once again a report and a consideration of health response to the pandemic. But that, of course, is an immediate issue, but we are looking as well in the longer term about what the nature of restrictions are. Over a period of time, they have been reduced, and it is important that decisions are made which are right for the times. And in July, we were at the period where you had the increase in the number of COVID infections. Fortunately, I've got to say, I'm very pleased that the health advice at that time that was given to National Cabinet, which is why we extended the paid pandemic leave entitlements for another 3 months, have proven to be correct. It did peak when the health advice was it would peak, and it is coming down, and that's a good thing.
Anna Henderson.
Anna Henderson from SBS and NITV. Prime Minister, Mer Island is the birthplace of Eddie Mabo and a place where there was great hopes for native title to really deliver for Indigenous empowerment. But there is a group on that island right now engaging with a Chinese state-owned enterprise hoping to provide investment into their community for infrastructure. Setting aside the Foreign Investment Review Board reality, what does it say to you that a community like that would be looking overseas in that way for help, for basic telecommunications assistance? And are you concerned about any national security implications of that discussion which is already underway?
Well, we'll make decisions based upon Australia's national security interests, and that includes in areas of communications. But I travelled to the Torres Strait and met with the Torres Strait Regional Authority, including the elected representatives of all of the islands, both central, outer and both sides, east and west, as well as the people in the peninsula who are represented as well. I also met with, Linda Burney travelled with me, of course. We met with the mayors of the 3 regional councils as well. And I've got to say it was a very positive discussion, and we will engage with the elected representatives and continue to, and I'm confident that Australia's national interest will be served. From time to time, there'll be voices. Communities aren't homogenous, right? And from time to time, there'll be views put that are not put by the elected representatives. The elected representatives were very clear in the meetings that we held, and it was very constructive.
You don't have to be elected, though, to have those conversations, I guess is what I'm saying. So if those conversations are happening, are you worried that there could be a chink in the armour here for Australia?
I'm not worried about Australia's national security interests at all with regard to the Torres Strait, because we will ensure that they're delivered on. And I think that one of the things about the Torres Strait as well, they have a great history of playing a role in our defence of our nation. And they've done that in the past, and I'm sure they'll continue to act in our national interest, and we will, of course, always act in our national interest as well.
James Massola.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks for the speech, Prime Minister. James Massola from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Just to follow up on Rosie's question, you didn't quite answer it for mine. So I'm wondering, perhaps if we ask it another way, will Damien Cook be able to play for the Rabbitohs on Friday night? And just in the interests of balance, an AFL question, should Tasmania have an AFL team? Is it time for the AFL and the other 18 clubs to do the right thing?
The big picture. I hope Tassie does get an AFL team. Tasmania has produced some great champions in AFL over a long period of time. They've had, of course, Hawthorn, the team that I support, have played at, I'm not sure what it's called these days, it was Aurora Stadium at one stage, in Lonnie, and of course North have played in Hobart. But that's a decision for the AFL to make. If on Thursday night, if far more detail than anyone needed, but you asked the question, if Melbourne beat Parramatta, then South will play East, as I still call them, not just this Friday, but in the first final, so it doesn't matter. I reckon a whole lot of players will be rested, and I encourage South's coach to make sure they keep the eye on the semi-final, which is what really matters. But I do think it's a bit cruel for you to raise anything relating to semi-finals while Jim Chalmers is in the room, who's still suffering from the Broncos.
But on Damien Cook, is he going to be an ISO come Friday?
I have no idea. That essentially is a decision for Premier Perrottet.
So we've got quite a lot more football questions to get to. Just checking that you're happy to...
I was expecting basketball questions today.
Well, I'm sure somebody might come up with one of those, but the ABC is going to be broadcasting for about another 15 minutes if you're happy to keep going.
Sure.
Great. Peter Van Onselen.
My question's about the Stage 3 income tax cuts, and it follows on from Andrew's. I sensed a little bit of wiggle room in your answer. It's sort of unusual for a politician. I just wanted to check, during the election campaign, Labor promised that it wouldn't repeal the Stage 3 tax cuts. I just wanted to know whether that was an ironclad rolled gold promise, or are there any circumstances whatsoever that you can envisage in this term of government doing anything at all that would resemble repealing of those Stage 3 tax cuts?
We stand by the comments that we made.
So there's no chance?
We stand by the comments that we made. So we made those comments at the time. We made those comments on the basis that we weren't successful in what we put forward. We failed by just one vote to make a difference there. But the other issue that is important for people is the issue of certainty, and we said that. But we face, of course we face real challenges. That's a reality of the fiscal position that we inherited of $1 trillion of debt, and that remains something that we are doing our best to deal with, and you'll see in the October budget that the ERC has been working really, really hard, and we'll be meeting again. In spite of the Jobs and Skills Summit, we'll be meeting again this week. We'll be meeting every week.
Mark Riley.
Mark Riley from the Seven Network. Prime Minister, you've mentioned the gender pay gap a few times today. When will you legislate to make the gender pay equity issue a part of the Fair Work Act, and what will be a metric for success on this for you come the next election? If it's 14% now, what do you want to see it by the time of the next election?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. We'll legislate this year to include gender pay equity as one of the objects of the Act, and a success will be a closing of the gap rather than expanding. The recent figures is going the wrong way. We want it to go the right way.
Ben Westcott.
Hello, Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. Thank you for your speech, Prime Minister. You spoke during your speech and in your answer to Chris about green manufacturing and your want to build the green manufacturing industry in Australia. But Australia is not alone in wanting to do this. The US, China and Canada have all made this a major part of their economic platforms. In fact, even a couple of weeks ago, when Chris Bowen spoke about building an EV battery industry in Australia, the same day, Joko Widodo, the Indonesian president, told us that he wanted to build exactly the same industry in Indonesia using their nickel. Has Australia missed the boat to take the lead on building a green manufacturing industry, and what can make us competitive against all these other competitors?
Getting on with it. That's the start. 10 years of delay and denial we're suffering from, but we have a number of advantages. Take nickel. If you go to the nickel refinery that BHP has in Kwinana, south of Perth, that's a facility that's world-class, that's employing large numbers of West Australians in good, secure, well-paid jobs. But we have everything. Nickel's one of the things that goes into a battery. We have everything that goes into it. We have natural advantages that we have through our resources. And what it takes is getting on with it. The government that we replaced was a barrier. You know, the sort of statements of, you know, electric vehicles would end your weekend were just extraordinary and just sent completely the wrong message to investors around the world that we were some flat earth society. You know, every auto manufacturer in the world, whether they be Japanese, Chinese, American, European, is not looking at internal combustion engines. They're all looking at EVs, they're looking at hydrogen vehicles, they're looking at a range of vehicles as well. And I noticed the coalition slipping back into that argument over the weekend about utes. You can't buy an electric vehicle ute. It's just absurd. We need to show that we are up for it. And I get great hope where you've had business that, in spite of government mechanisms, have powered through to take one, Tritium, is producing in southeast Queensland the fastest electric vehicle charging stations that were produced in the world, and exporting them to North America and to Europe. They're about to establish a plant in the United States as well to manufacture. But we have, if we seize the opportunity, we can do it here, but we can't do it unless government facilitates that private sector activity. The private sector, the business community are up for it. It's one of the reasons why when we signed off on our higher ambition for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we had the BCA, Australian Industry Group, Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and the NFF standing with us, supporting that changed policy. Now, that's something that is a really concrete example of what I've been talking about today, of looking for common purpose and common interests in the interests of business and unions and Australia, our national interest. Our national interest wasn't served by the playing of politics and the denial which was there. If we take it up, we can manufacture a whole lot more things here. We can be an exporter of renewable energy, such as the Sun Cable project into Singapore, for example, is something that we can do. But we also need to have, as a frame, how do we commercialise our innovation? Australia has always been ahead of the game. You know, we punch way above our weight in innovation, not the least in renewables at the Australian National University or the University of New South Wales and other places. There wouldn't be a solar panel in the world that doesn't have some intellectual property that was invented by an Australian scientist, a breakthrough, and yet we haven't commercialised that opportunity. We need to be better at it, and we're determined to be better at it. And that's why it's no accident either that Ed has the job not just of industry but science as well. It's about how you put those things together and seize the opportunity which is there.
Thank you.
Jade Dalberger.
Jade Galeberger from the Herald Sun. Prime Minister, just following on from Kieran's question, when this term are you willing to have a debate about how you're going to pay for not only your ambitious policies, rising expenditure and obviously the $1 trillion of debt? Will further tax reforms be part of that debate, and what could be on the table?
Well, we're having a consideration now of our budget in October, and you'll see that, our commitments, how we're going to pay for them, our analysis as well of the expenditure that we've inherited, going through line by line, trying to knock out waste and rorts which are there. So the job of reform is never done. There's not a date in which you come along here to the National Press Club and I'll have, you know, a mission accomplished sign at the back there that says we're done. We'll continue to engage in economic, social and environmental policy reform. I've said very clearly that I want to lead a government that has a crack, that has a go, that does what's necessary and that doesn't rest on our laurels. I'm excited by the fact that the Cabinet and the Ministry and the caucus are so up for debate and engagement in new ideas as well. And one of the things we're trying to do with the summit on Thursday and Friday is to expand that. So it's not just us. You know, we met in the lead up to the election. We obviously met with the unions who are connected to the Labor Party, and that's an important connection with working people that we have. But I also sat down with Jennifer and the BCA. In the coming fortnight, I think I'm speaking to the BCA dinner on Wednesday night. I'm speaking to the Australian Industry Group, and I'm speaking to the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I'm engaged. We're up for the debate. We're up for ideas, and we'll continue to engage. So I see it as a continuous process, not something that says we'll have this on this date. Something that after the October budget, we'll have another process that leads into the May budget, where we'll give consideration, including to the changed circumstances which are there. At the moment, obviously, inflation is an issue that's a global issue that we're dealing with as well. That's part of the context of the October budget that we're dealing with.
Dom Giannini.
Dom Giannini from the Australian Associated Press. Thank you, Prime Minister. Just turning to international relations, what do you make of the allegations that a Chinese slush fund was used to pay off MPs in Honiara? And are you concerned about their move towards Chinese values, where they seem to be shutting out the press that criticise China? They seem to be rejecting US boats docking. How do we fix that relationship without just saying we're going to offer them further respect? It doesn't seem to be working in the 100 days that you've taken office.
Well, it's true that Australia's international relations and global circumstances haven't been completely transformed in 100 days. That's true. But what we have done is change the way that we're perceived. Penny Wong today is in Papua New Guinea. Later this week she'll be in Timor-Leste. I'll be hosting Jose Ramos Horta, as well as Prime Minister Sogavare in Australia in the coming period. I will be going to the PM's 13 versus the Kumals match with Prime Minister Marape, who I spoke to on Thursday and congratulated him on his election. We attended the Pacific Island Forum. We attended in a way that engaged and treated people with respect, and we, I think, have shown leadership, and I particularly pay tribute to Penny Wong and Pat Conroy for the efforts that they have made, which are outstanding, and that continues to happen. So it's a matter of the way that we're perceived. If we sit in Canberra, while the advice was given to the former government about what was happening in the Solomons, and don't respond for months, no one visited the Solomons, no one engaged properly in what was happening there, and eventually they sent a very junior former senator now to visit the Sollies. That's not a great way to achieve a positive outcome. So we'll continue to engage. I continue to have discussions, some of which are public, some of which are private, with leaders in our region, and we'll continue to engage, including in the Solomons. But this is something that didn't happen on our watch. This is something, though, that we believe in the national interest we need to engage with in a way that's respectful of people's national sovereignty, but in a way that clearly makes it clear what Australia's national interest is.
And what you make of the corruption allegations?
Sorry, Dom, we were right on time. Last question to Amanda Kopp.
Hi, Amanda Kopp from National Radio News and the Community Radio Network. You said in opposition and in this speech that the previous government was obsessed with secrecy. National Cabinet is meeting on Wednesday, and yet you continue the secrecy around National Cabinet that came over from your predecessor. You claim that open access to information from National Cabinet will damage relations between the state and the Commonwealth. That position is inconsistent with the previous FOI approach with COAG, which replaced National Cabinet, and inconsistent with a ruling by Justice White. Why, when you say that you want to be transparent and in this speech that you want to rebuild trust in government, Why would you keep important information from the public?
We haven't. We've told the public exactly what's happened at every National Cabinet meeting, exactly what's been discussed. This week we'll be discussing health and we'll be discussing skills and the summit. And we're meeting the day before the summit, not by accident. And we've been transparent about all of the results. The difference is as well that we've come to common purposes, and there's been one press conference after a National Cabinet meeting. It's been held by me, which has told people what we have all agreed. We haven't had to have the Prime Minister give a press conference, then the Victorian Premier give a different one, then New South Wales give a different one, then Queensland give a different one as well. We're working together in a constructive way, and that is very positive. And the dialogue with the Premiers and Chief Ministers has been very positive. We've had a press conference after the one that we held here in Canberra.
Then why aren't you releasing documents under
Well, what documents are there? That implies that there's...
So you're saying there's no documents?
Well, that implies that there's all these documents floating around, and that would be, just a mischaracterisation of the nature of the discussions which are taking place. Decisions on a whole lot of the health concerns, for example, are a matter for the states. What we're doing is working things through, largely verbally, of what is occurring, and then coming to a common ground of positions. I assure you, to give you the big tip, before the last National Cabinet meeting was called on a Saturday morning before Friday night, you can have all of the papers exactly, because there weren't any. We had a discussion about the issues that we were dealing with on paid pandemic leave. We had a discussion, we came to an outcome, it was announced. It was a good thing. But people have, between governments, from time to time, people have got to be able to have discussions as well that are private, that produce outcomes. That has to happen. And quite frankly, I'm about outcomes in terms of these processes, and I make no apologies for that. The issue of so-called secrecy, previously you didn't know even when they were happening. The next National Cabinet meeting is happening on Wednesday, and I'm very positive that will come to some good outcomes with it.
Thank you.
Please thank the Prime Minister.
And that was Anthony Albanese at the National Press Club here in Canberra, making his first appearance as Prime Minister. He was marking, or perhaps celebrating is the better word, 100 days in office for his government. And of course, as you heard, he used the speech to highlight some of Labor's achievements so far and a couple of the election promises it has fulfilled as well.